We were the emperor's soldiers. Whether in military brothels or in the villages, we raped without reluctance." Unquote. The system seemed to give many Japanese soldiers a feeling of invincibility and invulnerability, and also complemented the already deeply ingrained group ethic that frowned upon individuality. Ultranationalists, inside and outside of government and the military, drove forward rearmament, as well as the quest for natural resources and colonies, using as a pretext the perceived threat to Japan posed by the Western powers. This movement gained particular momentum, as well as widespread support, because of the Western powers' snubbing of Japan at the international level, particularly over membership of the imperialist club. Such slights would engender feelings of hatred for the Occidentals, and the opportunity rose to take revenge against them. Senior Japanese officers openly encouraged the maltreatment and murder of Allied POWs by their men. A philosophical revolution occurred in Japan. An idea developed that Japan was at the center of the world. Japanese people were superior to all other races. This would eventually lead to Kodo Shugisha, the imperial way, the divine mission to bring all nations under one roof. The Japanese term adopted for their putative empire was the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, demonstrating how those in power attempted to cloak their empire building under the lie that Japan was liberating fellow Asians from the cruel yoke of Occidental imperialism. Such ideas can still be found in Japan today, as any visit to the Yasukuni Shrine's attached museum in Tokyo demonstrates. Ideas of racial superiority common to the Japanese military by the mid-1930s certainly contributed to the barbarism displayed by its forces. Ironically, much of that barbarism was directed against fellow Asians, making a mockery of Japan's claim to be a liberator rather than just another imperialist. The worst example is the rape of Nanking in 1937. The Japanese occupation force, commanded by Hirohito's uncle, General Prince Asaka, murdered over 300,000 Chinese POWs and civilians in the then Chinese capital. One of the major events to push Japan much further down the militarist road was the failure of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles to recognize Japan's territorial claims in Asia. Before World War I, Japan had already started building a small empire, gaining Taiwan and China's Liaodong Peninsula in 1895. The nation had defeated China in 1895 and Russia in 1905, the latter a spectacular coup that made the world sit up and take notice of this grasping little Asian power. In 1905, Korea was added to Japan's growing empire before being formally annexed 5 years later. Japan had been an ally of Britain, France, and the United States during the Great War, capturing German colonies in China and the Pacific, and even sending warships to the Mediterranean. Yet when it came to divide up the spoils, Japan was effectively snubbed by its own allies. Many influential Japanese, probably rightly, felt the heavy hand of racism and disparaged the League of Nations, which existed, in the words of leading nationalist thinker Shumei Okawa, quote, to preserve the status quo and further the domination of the world by the Anglo-Saxons, unquote. In turn, Okawa argued that, quote, Japan would strive to fulfill her predestined role as champion of Asia, unquote, in reference to the imperial way. Okawa was one of 4 very significant philosophers who managed to place militarism and ultranationalism into mainstream Japanese life between the wars. Ikki Kita was another, who advocated blending the ultranationalist movement with the Japanese military. He also advocated a coup d'etat to rid Japan of its corrupt democratic government. Kita's plan was for the military to rescind the 1889 Meiji Constitution, ban political parties, reform the imperial diet or parliament, and nationalize industry. Then, the Japanese would embark upon their crusade to free Asia from Western imperialism, that is, build their own empire. The government banned Ikikita's books, and they soon became very popular with young army and navy officers who were most susceptible to such radical and nationalist ideas. Okawa proposed the idea of a clash of civilizations between Japan and the West. He created an ideology that neatly encapsulated many Japanese desire for hegemony, which he christened Hako Ichue, literally 8 chords, 1 roof, which has been interpreted as 8 corners of the world under one roof. Okawa believed that as Japan was the world's oldest nation-state, it was her divine mission to rule the world. Racial superiority, creating an Asian empire, and the divinity of the emperor were all strongly highlighted by the media to actively encourage such thinking among the Japanese population. These ideas again found particularly willing disciples among the Japanese military. Another philosopher, Seigo Nakano, believed in the rebirth of Japan through the old samurai ethics blended with a more modern form of Chinese Confucianism and a populist nationalism modelled on European fascism. Nakano was one of the many philosophers to highlight the story of Saigo Takamori, calling his death in 1877 the true spirit of the Japanese, and again, such heroic stories were very popular between the wars. General Sadao Araki, whose appointments as education and later army minister gave him a unique platform from which to actually disseminate ultra-nationalist ideas into the mainstream, was another prominent driving force behind Japan's quest for empire. Araki, who had a wide following among junior officers, introduced Suishin Hyoku, spiritual training, into the military and civilian worlds, a modified and perverted form of the old samurai Bushido code. Importantly, the old compassionate elements of the code were deleted, with important ramifications for those captured by the Japanese, leaving only a pitiless catalogue of martial prowess, rigid duty, and utter loyalty as the underlying tenets to be absorbed by society. War was presented as purified, and death as a duty. Other events from the 1930s propelled Japan towards war. The 1930 London Naval Treaty had been forced on the Japanese by Britain and America, the idea being to put the brakes on Japanese naval expansion that threatened the Occidentals' military superiority in Asia and the Pacific. All it did was confirm in the minds of many Japanese the idea that their nation was being prevented from following its preordained destiny, and importantly, was being held to double standards. The Occidental countries could do as they pleased, while Japan could not, simply because her people were Orientals. The treaty engendered deep-seated hostility and racism towards the Western powers, particularly the United States, in all levels of Japanese society. It was an opportunity for the more radical elements inside the military to attempt to seize control and push the country towards completing their dream of Hako Ichue. The May 15th incident in 1932, when Prime Minister Tsuyoshi Inukai was assassinated by a group of young naval officers and army cadets, was viewed by many in Japan as a patriotic act, further reinforcing the by now widely held view that Western-style democracy and party politics were corrupt and useless, and actually hindering Japan's destiny to rule Asia. The first stage in making Hako Ichue a reality was a holy war against China. The barbarism of Japan's wars in China in 1931 to 32 and 1937 onwards demonstrated the ingrained racism of the wartime Japanese towards their enemies, and the success of the spiritual training that the troops had received since schoolboys. It also indicated that when Japan made war on the Occidentals, they could expect the same doctrines to be applied to them. On the battlefield, we never really considered the Chinese humans, said Japanese veteran Uno Shintaro. When you're winning, the losers look really miserable. We concluded that the Japanese race was superior. This was a common enough attitude during a war and not limited to the Japanese, but the accompanying systematic massacres and their horrific brutality were. It is estimated that 10.2 million Chinese perished in China proper, exclusive of ethnic Chinese murdered in Western colonies between 1931 and 1945. One of the most notorious murder campaigns outside of the rape of Nanking was the infamous Jinmetsu Sakusen, burn to ash strategy. Popularized in 1957 was the more ominous sounding Sanko Sakusen, kill all, burn all, and loot all. This scorched earth offensive was conducted by the Japanese in eastern China between 1942 and 1945, in response to the December 1940 Chinese Communist-led 100 Regiments offensive. Japanese historian Mitsuyoshi Himeta estimates that 2.7 million Chinese were killed in the Three Alls policy. In 1940, Prime Minister Prince Konoe proclaimed the National Defense State. Mobilization was announced, as well as the government's complete control over the nation's assets. All political parties were abolished. The Japanese prepared for total war. Japanese school textbooks taught children all about Japan's divine mission to unite East and West under Tokyo's control. Democracy, that Western imposition which so frustrated and angered many Japanese philosophers and military officers, was shouldered aside in a return to military government. Young Japanese military recruits were not only molded into obedient tools of the militarists through propaganda and school textbooks, but also through a brutal military training program that employed physical violence to punish even the slightest transgressions. Recruits were beaten, made to perform unnecessarily strenuous tasks, and very often were not fed properly. One of the explanations for Japanese military brutality is the way in which its soldiers were trained. As superiors literally beat on inferiors, the ordinary Japanese soldiers at the bottom of the system were left with little outlet for their frustrations and pent-up anger, other than those unfortunates that came into their power, usually defenseless civilians and prisoners of war. This important point also occurs in the Japanese soldier's relationship with his Korean and Formosan colleagues. During the war, the Japanese impressed thousands of young Korean and Formosan men as army auxiliaries, using them particularly as prison camp guards. The Germans did the same in the concentration camp system, where brutal Ukrainian auxiliaries worked under SS supervision. The Japanese officers and soldiers routinely treated Korean and Formosan soldiers with utter contempt, beating and humiliating them even though they were ostensibly allies. In turn, Allied POWs consistently noted that Korean and Formosan guards were among the most brutal of their captors, as these humiliated underdogs of the Japanese war machine worked off their shame and loss of face on prisoners of war. At Sandakan 1 camp on the island of Borneo, the Australian prisoners noticed a dramatic change in the level of brutality once a large party of Formosan guards arrived in April 1943. The Japanese treated the Formosans as their inferiors, and the Formosans took to delivering mass beatings of POW work details under the flimsiest of pretexts. My gang would be working all right, and then would suddenly be told to stop. The men would then be stood with their arms outstretched horizontally, shoulder high, facing the sun without hats, recalled Warrant Officer First Class Bill Sticklerich, the Royal Australian Army Service. Guards would form themselves into two groups, one covering the prisoners with their rifles, and the other doing the actual beating. They would walk along the back of us and smack us underneath the arms, across the ribs, and on the back, said Sticklerich. They would give each man a couple of bashes. If they whimpered or flinched, they would get a little more. Japanese guards treated Koreans no better than prisoners, writes Gavin Dawes in Prisoners of the Japanese. Like another breed of mongrel dog to kick. One said to an Englishman, "Ingeris Korean Samo," all prisoner Nippon. Another said to an Australian, "Yumi Seimo." But for every one miserable Korean who saw life in the camps that way, there were all the others, Hatchet Face, Shadrach the Shitbag, and the rest, taking out their rage against the Japanese on the prisoners. "Seimo," said the Australian with feeling, "like hell," unquote. Within the paradigm of Asian superior-inferior relationships, the violence and humiliation characteristics of those relationships flowed ever downwards until it found an outlet, and that outlet was always those people that the Japanese military already considered worthless, the racially inferior Chinese, as they would say, or the dishonorable and cowardly Allied prisoners of war. The ingrained violence of Japanese military training and power relationships does not fully explain wartime bestiality, but it does suggest the Japanese soldier was partly dehumanized by the training that he had received, as coupled with the strong influence of the radicalized officer corps that made him more susceptible to blindly following amoral orders with fear of brutal punishment or exclusion from the group. The Japanese soldier was also laboring under the rigorously and violently enforced concept that superiors were completely infallible, and that any order issued by a superior should be treated as an order given by the divine emperor himself. The Japanese military already had young minds that were more readily prepared to accept such ideas, because Japanese society itself was hierarchical and highly Confucian in design, where elders, teachers, and parents were minor gods to be obeyed without question, and where the group ethic was a central unifying concept for the nation. For Westerners raised on ideas of individuality, freedom, self-expression, and democracy, it is difficult to comprehend the entirely different and often opposed mindset of Asian peoples. The Japanese preoccupations with face, conformity, and the group were powerful inhibitors to any Japanese soldier questioning his leader's decisions. To refuse an order was to commit social suicide and risk exclusion from the group. Ultimately, there are very few examples of Japanese soldiers refusing to carry out patently criminal orders. Those that do exist are almost exclusively those of senior officers who, due to their rank and status within the pyramidal military structure, were largely immune from punishment.
Fight or make room for those who will.
In the early 20th century, Japanese imperialism was largely held in check through military cooperation and diplomatic agreements with the Western powers. Japan's leaders desperately wanted their nation to be given equal status with the Occidental nations, and to acquire an equal right to sit at the imperialist table. The Japanese were frustrated, as we had seen, because the Western powers never viewed the Japanese as anything other than a slightly superior form of Asian, and certainly not as their racial, ideological, or political equals. The insecurity and anger felt by Japanese politicians and military leaders had not been fully admitted to the imperialist club, and the often subtle racism that their nation suffered contributed enormously to xenophobia towards foreigners that grew rapidly from the 1920s and 30s in Japan, and to the rise of militarism and even fascism amongst the country's leaders. It would be one of the major reasons why European and American prisoners were often humiliated, tortured, and or murdered in World War II. The Japanese rejected the Geneva Conventions and other such symbols of civilized warfare. Quote, "The Japanese have torn the Geneva Convention to pieces. White men could go to hell. The Japanese would be the ones to send them there," unquote, wrote Gabazon. The Hague and Geneva Conventions had no place within a military society that advocated death in battle or ritual suicide as the greatest expressions of manhood. The Japanese labeled the conventions the coward's code, and they meant it. The Japanese often tried to impress other Asian peoples by parading starving Allied prisoners before them. It was motivated by a racist pan-Asianism and a desire to show former colonial subjects the impotence of their Western masters. Japanese feelings of inferiority transmogrified easily into violence when whites fell under their power, a classic example of the boot on the other foot mentality. Quote, "The march went on all day under a hot sun, with only 2 halts in the playgrounds of 2 schools, and the children were allowed to come close up to the prisoners to jeer and spit at us," recalled one British POW who was paraded before locals in Japanese-occupied Korea. It was those at the pinnacle of military power, the generals, who decided to brutalize prisoners of war, and who made the conditions so deplorable inside the camps. More junior officers and other ranks went along with these crimes because they believed orders to be needed. The emperor wished them to commit such outrages. In some cases they were correct. Concerning the aforementioned 3 All Scholar siege in China, Emperor Hirohito personally sanctioned this genocidal crusade. Generals who commanded this operation were hanged as war criminals, but their ultimate authority, the emperor, was never placed on the stand for his part in killing millions of innocent people. The Japanese were also no respecters of bravery in their opponents, for they only acknowledged the battlefield superiority of their own men, and accordingly treated all POWs with the same lack of humanity. A Malay platoon that had made a particularly valiant stand before Singapore City at the end of the conflict in Malaya in 1942 was massacred after they ran out of ammunition and surrendered, and its young commander, Lieutenant Adnan bin Saidi, was hung upside down from a tree and bayoneted to death for sport. The generals knew that the deeply ingrained respect for authority of the average Japanese, coupled with the fear of exclusion from the group and the concomitant loss of faith, meant that very little resistance was encountered among Japanese troops ordered to do morally dubious things. The whites had been the masters of Asia before 1941, and it was they, when official Japanese military thinking, who had tried to keep the Japanese down, and had refused to recognize Japan's legitimate right to be a great power. Now that the boot was on the other foot, Japanese troops enjoyed stamping on the white man's face. It was race war, and the levels of barbarity and cruelty indicative of the hatred and loathing, and the hidden inferiority complex harbored by many Japanese soldiers towards their white foes. Quote, by 1941, they were ready to take on the white world in war, and they truly did not care any more what the white man thought of them. Unquote. During Japan's blitzkrieg across Asia between December 1941 and mid-1942, they captured 320,000 Allied soldiers. At the fall of Singapore in February 1942, the Japanese, who were outnumbered virtually 2 to 1, were astounded when 70,000 British, Indian, Malay and Australian troops laid down their arms and marched themselves off to captivity at Changi. To young and propaganda-conditioned Japanese soldiers who saw themselves as modern-day samurai, surrender was the most dishonorable concept imaginable, especially surrender to a numerically inferior opponent. Better to die than to accept such a humiliating and shameful fate. They neither cared for nor understood the Occidentals' acceptance of surrender under certain circumstances, nor the lack of shame attached to saving lives when fighting no longer served any useful military purpose. The Japanese had already denigrated the Geneva Convention as the coward's code, and the behavior of white soldiers appearing to be another Western ideology as morally corrupt and contemptible as democracy or party politics. Remember your status as prisoners of war. You have no rights. International law and the Geneva Convention are dead, announced one Japanese camp commandant to his prisoners in 1942. If the POWs believed they were victims with rights, the Japanese, they were a sullen, disgraced mob who had lost their rights as individuals and were to be treated as such, comments Christopher Bailey and Tim Harper. The Japanese herded their prisoners into over 600 camps across Asia. The common factors that linked these camps together were privation,